America strikes. The Biden administration carrying out a mass series of airstrikes in both Iraq and Syria. And I want to show you some new video that we have just gotten in of what's happening there on the ground. This is the aftermath of one of the strikes. The U.S. hit, we understand, 85 targets. The U.S. hitting Iranian-backed militants who were responsible for the drone attack in which 3 American soldiers were killed and dozens more were injured in Jordan.
It is one of the military's most solemn rituals. At Dover Air Base in Delaware today, the commander-in-chief paying respect to the soldiers whose sacrifice was ultimate. 3 caskets holding Staff Sergeant William Rivers, who today received a posthumous promotion, and Sergeants Kennedy Sanders and Breonna Moffett, all 3 from an engineering unit based in Georgia. They were killed last weekend in their beds in Tower 22 in Jordan.
You see, when this thing happened, the United States had 4 choices on how to respond. Choice number 1 was to do nothing, and that we can discard right away. That's not going to happen. I mean, there's just no way the United States can ignore something like that. Now, that leaves us with 3 choices. Number 1 is to attack Iran directly. Go to Iran and bomb the hell out of it. Now, obviously, that has its own complications, meaning that, obviously, number 1, most of Iranians don't even support the current regime. So who are you going to be punishing, really? Number 2, complexities on the military scale of things. It's a massive country. It's a complicated issue. And on top of it, who is going to clean up the mess? If you demolish Iran like you did Iraq, who's going to be there to pick up the pieces, to rebuild the country? What kind of mess are you going to create there post the Iranian regime? It might be even worse. On top of it, if you do that, you're essentially igniting a regional war. You're pushing the Hezbollah into war with Israel to retaliate, much like it happened with Iraq and Israel, with the US striking Iraq. On top of it, there's an election year in the United States. That's not a viable scenario for this administration. Now, let's talk about a different scenario. Of course, the United States could suffocate the supply of energy from Iran outwards. I mean, they export almost 2 million barrels a day. They could easily close that loop right away by bombing the distribution, bombing the supply chain, and essentially suffocating economically Iran, pushing to the downfall of the regime. Now, the problem with that specific issue is that it's going to create a massive supply chain issue globally, which is insanely inflationary. At the time when the United States is fighting inflation in an election year, trying to get it to 2% to say mission accomplished, hurting supply chains like this globally is going to be insanely counterproductive. Because you see, while the United States does not buy oil or energy from Iran, the pricing is global. And when one supply chain gets wrecked, the rest of the world pricing goes up. And that's not very good in an election year. That's not very good for inflation. So that option goes right the window. And that leaves you with one choice, really, which is the proportionate response against the perpetrators directly. The militias that were backed by Iran will be bombed by the United States, and they're going to be blown to smithereens. And although that option will be loud and there's going to be a lot of explosions, the problem with that option, it's not going to solve the underlying issue. It's like treating the symptom, not the source of the disease. You're not going after the people who sent these militia forces, i.e. Iran. You're going after the militia forces themselves, which the Iranians, 1, don't care about. Number 2, they can refarm them at any time because they usually farm these militia forces in countries that have weak governance, a lot of racial tensions, Sunni versus Shiite. There's a reason that work in Lebanon. There's a reason that work in Yemen. There's a reason that work in Iraq. There's a reason these countries are used to farm these militia forces. So you kill a bunch of them, the Iranians are going to farm more. It's not a problem for them, and they don't value their life at all. So essentially, this is going to be like putting a band-aid on a much bigger problem, but it will buy you some quiet. Maybe a few weeks, maybe a few months. Unfortunately, this would leave Iran still as the decision maker in a lot of countries that influence what's going on in the Middle East. De facto, right now, Iran already takes every single decision in Lebanon, every single decision in Syria, and most decisions in Yemen, and a lot of decisions in Iraq. We hear about 3 or 4 militia forces that they operate, 3 or 4 proxies, but Iran has tens of them. And they now essentially become an octopus in the Middle East that create destabilization, violence, and terror. And by striking a specific militia group, you're not really treating the problem. Now, what's going to happen right now, I think, is the US will choose strategically targets in Syria and in Iraq, but not in Iran. They're not going to strike in Iran. And the strategy would be very simple. Number 1, destroy the current military capabilities of these militias, kill as many of them as possible, ruin their infrastructure, their training centers, and cut off the Iranian supply chain from Iran to Syria and to Iraq that power these militias. Now that would work for a while, but Iran will rebuild that road, they will rebuild that supply chain, and they will refarm these militia forces. And you see, the problem with this strategy is that although it buys you some quiet, a few months of quiet, which is needed for the elections, it doesn't create a price. It doesn't charge Iran a painful price for what they've done. It does not deter Iran from future issues like this. It doesn't create any fear in Iran because Iranians have no issue losing a few proxies, breaking a few eggs to make an omelet. They don't care. They don't value their life whatsoever. These are just pieces on the chessboard for them. So what happens in life when you let a bully get away with it? When you don't stand up for yourself? When you enable somebody like that? When you appease a bully? Does the bully leave you alone? Did you ever in history heard about a bully that left somebody alone because they actually conformed and appeased the bully? Did it happen with Putin? Did it happen with Hitler? And actually, you don't have to go far to see how this thing works. We don't have to go to World War II and Hitler. We can look at what happened in Afghanistan. The way the US left Afghanistan led us to the invasion in Ukraine and to the war in Israel, no doubt. And now, the same thing is slowly brewing up in the Middle East. So appeasing the Iranians by letting them get off the hook with this is not a very good strategy. And you have to look at this whole thing in a wider context. Right now, the Middle East strategy for the United States has shifted. When we got to 2024, to an election year, their priorities has changed. And right now, the United States is pushing for de-escalation at any price. No regional war, complete quiet during an election year. The problem is this strategy may lead to some quiet in the beginning, but it's going to lead, ironically, to a massive escalation and an eruption of violence later. Remember that Seinfeld episode, Serenity Now, Insanity Later? This is literally what's going to happen. The result is an absolute continued proxy activity in the Middle East, which is going to cause more mayhem, more chaos. You're splitting Israel with this new ceasefire deal internally, which will weaken Israel and embolden Hamas, which will bring much more violence on the doorstep of the United States in this region. And it will come back to bite the United States in the ass after this whole thing blows over. Yes, they'll get a few quiet months, maybe even a year, but then it will come back worse than ever. But then it's not going to be an election year, and it might be somebody else's problem, so who cares, right? More violence, more chaos, more insanity, more destabilization. So this is going to force eventually the United States to confront finally Iran. They're going to have to deal with the problem eventually, not just the symptoms. And after the election year goes away, they will. And at that point, Iran will be done. It will be barbecue chicken. Because although Iran can inflict some damage on Israel, maybe on the US, it is no match for the US military might. So it will be absolutely annihilated, and the regime will be replaced with somebody more comfortable, more convenient, and somebody more along the lines of what the United States can work with. But it will come at greater cost of life on all sides, on greater loss of property, on greater loss of quality of life, of stability in the region, and all these things that we are now trying to protect by appeasing the Iranians will come back worse than ever when we have to hit it directly. And as the old saying goes, it's always darkest just before the break of dawn, which is exactly what we're seeing here. Things are about to get a lot worse because of these policy mistakes, but it will eventually lead to the downfall of the Iranian regime, which hopefully will bring this region back to stability and back to coexistence. Thank you so much. And before you leave, if you would like to support our work here on the channel, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/Tom-Report. Most of these videos are simply not monetized because of the nature of the conflict, which is completely understandable. If you would like to be one of our supporters, check it out. Thank you for the existing Patreon supporters. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'll see you in the next one.